So we're going to kick things off today with a segment on the history and the future of the secular movement. We have some outstanding speakers here to give us some valuable insight. First up is Michael Werner, and Michael is the president of the Humanist Foundation. He's the past president of the American Humanist Association, as well as vice president of the Unitarian Universalist Humanist group. He's an adjunct faculty member of the Humanist Institute and has taught at the Unitarian Universalist Theological School, Meadville Lombard. He has written extensively for the Fellowship of Religious Humanists. He has taught at major universities and at many local humanist groups. He's also one of the founders of Smart Recovery, a self-management and recovery training program for addictions, which we'll be highlighting later on in this program. He teaches classes on ethics, epistemology, addictions, and humanism. His essays are featured in the Humanist magazine. He's an activist on anti-racism, reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, and ecology. And he's the author of What Can You Believe In If You Don't Believe in God? It's one of the best books that personally I've read on humanism. Michael, welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. This is strange for me. Usually I do teach a class on humanist history, and it usually is an all-day class. So I'm going to apologize if I'm quick and I leave out a lot. One of the things is I really appreciate you're doing this training, bringing together a lot of different groups. I'm going to try and give some of the history on some of those groups. I apologize right up front if I don't give the history on some of your particular groups, but we're just going to cover what we can at the time we have. I just want you to know personally how I got here. My journey began when I was about 10 or 11 years of age, believe it or not, in church. I lived in a very bad area. I had a pretty rough childhood, and I prayed to God to take it all away from me. But of course, there's nothing that fails like prayer. And all of a sudden it occurred to me that nobody around me knew what they were talking about. And I didn't either. And I doubted everything I was believing. And I said to myself these important words that just ring through me my whole life. I don't know what the truth is, but I'm going to seek it no matter what. If it's hell, so be it. So here I am, the Satan's work out of all of that. For many years, I studied religion, philosophy, and it was only till I was about 40 that I was able to actually speak about it, that I figured that I had my stuff together enough to really talk about it, and now you can't shut me up about it. But anyway, I'm personally a humanist. As Ray Bragg said, we believe what we must, not what we want. It's a matter of intellectual integrity, a commitment to open-minded truth. As Carl Sagan said, we make the world significant by the courage of our questions and the depths of our answers. I'm an unabashed promoter of humanism, because I don't think that humanism is the only way to a good life. In fact, I know many good Christians that live good lives, but I think it's the best way. I don't think humanism is just an option. I think it's the best option. But we have not done a good job in telling our story. Keep in mind that all we have are tentative conclusions, because all knowledge is three things. It's tentative, it's fallible, and it's probabilistic. But some of the things that we believe are stronger than others. I like the idea of thinking about humanism as an evolving tradition. It never stays the same. The Europeans, I love their phrase for it, they call it an evolving life stance. We're not talking about doctrines, but an attitude towards life. We're looking for a whole integrated world view of life, a Weltanschauung. We're looking to devote ourselves to profound ideals. And as John Dewey said, we are looking for those ideals and ends so inclusive that they unify the self. We desire, as he calls it, a North Star to guide us. Dewey saw all of our experiences involved in a devotion to the ideal. The healthy person unifies and harmonizes all their experiences into a whole life in that devotion to the ideal. The philosopher George Santayana said, to feel beauty is a better thing to understand how we come to feel it, to have imagination and taste, to love the best, to be carried to a contemplation of nature, to, as he calls it, a vivid faith of the ideal. All this and more, a great deal more than any science can hope to be. When Santayana refers to a vivid faith in the ideal, he is talking about humanism. But humanism is not just secularism, rationalism, or atheism. Atheism is what I don't believe, but humanism is what I do believe. I love when people say, well, you're an atheist, you don't believe anything. And I believe everybody here has very strong beliefs about what they do believe. Many think arrogantly that once they know one thing, that God doesn't exist, that's all they need to know. But to me, it's only the beginning. It's only the beginning of a lifelong search for truth and meaning. Humanism begins with responsibility. A locus of control is us, not God, fate, or magic. Humanism is about our values, not our beliefs. It's about an attitude about life. There's no absolute answers here, no relativism either. And the good life and social justice we see as social ideals. The Greeks had a word, eudaimonia. For many years, they translated that as happiness, that all of us will seek happiness. But scholars in recent years have translated that as flourishing. And I think that's what we all want to do. We don't want to just be happy. We want to flourish. We believe in a naturalistic humanism that focuses on human welfare, where we believe that this world is all there is, but it's all in enough. Back in prehistoric times, sitting around a campfire, a child asked the parent, looking up at the sky, the dark sky, with the stars above, saying, what are those lights up above? What happens when we die? Where did we come from? How shall we live? And those are the big questions that every culture, every child, every adult has asked themselves. And we have answers for those too. Socrates said that there's only two big questions in life. What is true and how should we live? The axial age began around 800 to about 200 BCE. And in that period, there was a flowering in three areas, Greece, India, and China, especially for secularists. In Greece, they started challenging the gods, were even in charge or even important. You've heard of Protagoras saying man is the measure of all things, which can be interpreted a lot of different ways. But philosophy split with Plato and Aristotle. Plato focused on eternal forms, where Aristotle focused on reason. And as we'll see, Christianity pretty much focused on Platonic concepts, where we are more in Aristotelian tradition. But also overseas, especially in Theravadic non-theistic Buddhism, asked the big question, how do we deal with suffering? And he gave us ethical guidelines called the Threefold Path. Confucius also asked us to focus on ethical and higher culture rather than the gods. But as we well know, major religions in the West started to dominate, and the ideas from two great cities determined Western culture. Athens showed how reason and free inquiry could be used, whereas Jerusalem, with the three Abrahamic religions, pointed out where faith and supernaturalism could dominate. And Athens' literature was lost for centuries, even though they produced a lot of great literature, but it was lost for centuries. Hypatia was the librarian at Alexandria, but the Christians persecuted and tormented her, and she was one of our first martyrs, along with Socrates, of course, and she was excoriated. And by the way, if you don't know what excoriation is where they take oyster shells or sharp tiles and skin a person with while they're alive. But her sin was having books. So they burnt the library at Alexandria. We lost much of the literature of that period. And of course, we know that the age of theocracy from 400 AD to about 1000 AD went about, and some call it the Dark Ages. But in 1415, the Gutenberg Bible came out, the Gutenberg Press, and it radically changed the way people looked at religion, because up to that point, the priests had the only Bibles and gave out all the information. The Protestant Reformation asked people to think for themselves and read the Bible for themselves and determine their own religious ideas. And in a sense, a weird sense, we are that radical extension of that idea of thinking for ourselves. St. Thomas Aquinas was best known for coming up with three rational reasons for the existence of God, whereas St. Augustine based religion on faith or direct experience. And we know that that battle continues today for justifying religion. But as the Renaissance came about, the Greek and Roman texts were found primarily in Italy, but also in Spain, Germany, Netherlands, and Erasmus and Abelard are two of the main figures. But keep in mind, they still believed in God, but they thought that the focus of religion should not be the church, but on human welfare. Reason, though, can be as a tool in religious affairs. And in Florence, the de Medicis were the primary promoters of this philosophy. But we also know that we had 200 years of religious wars. Out of that came the Age of Enlightenment. Descartes, Hume, Bacon, Locke, and Voltaire all looked at human reason could expose the handiwork of God. They may have been believers, but our duty was to understand the clockwork mechanism behind it. And that reason and science were better tools than blind faith to obtain the good life. The good life could be found with reason. Now, as I point out here, how do we get to a modern day humanism today? And it's step by step. All of these pieces are coming together. We're learning a little bit more. We can't say that Socrates was a humanist with some of his attitudes, but he certainly paved the way with a lot of his ideas. And so did a lot of the Age of Enlightenment did. In France, Voltaire and the philosophes, they were openly atheistic. There was no question about that. But they did not have an alternative story, which is a real problem for a lot of people. They didn't know where we came from or what was to guide us ethically. And we also had, during that period, the reactionary romantic movement led by Rousseau, who felt that intuition, primitive nature, emotions were better guides. And we see that tug of war, that dialectic continuing today. But again, atheism never went far because there was no alternative story. Emerson, he developed transcendentalism, which is a naturalistic, but it's an evocative metaphor that he used called the oversoul. He later abandoned it when Darwin's story of evolution came out. And in 1849, when Darwin came out with his story, it gave a story of our origin, where we're going, what happens with us, and maybe even some of our ethics he pointed towards. Towards the end of the 19th century, though, there was a flowering with this information of a lot of organizations and knowledge within the secular community. There was a Free Religious Association where Ralph Waldo Emerson, Felix Adler, Potter were involved. There were also people like free thinkers like the early feminists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton with her famous phrase, "No gods, no masters." In their Declaration of Sentiments presented at Seneca Falls Convention held in 1848 at Seneca Falls, New York, it's often credited with initiating the first organized women's rights and women's suffrage movement in the United States. I point out that the first wave feminists all viewed religion as a tool for male oppression. Also at the same time, there was a lot of free thought communities that came out of Germany. If you look in upper Ohio and Indiana, almost all of the small towns were started by free thinkers, these German free thinkers. Now, they didn't last very long because they were cults of personality. But Kurt Vonnegut was a third generation survivor of those, and a couple of them still exist. Unita and Amana. If you've ever bought a Unita refrigerator, well, that's where it came from. They were socialistic communities. At this time also, Colonel Robert Ingersoll came about, known as the Great Agnostic, and pointed out that religion was harmful. He called himself agnostic, but he really was an atheist, trying to tell people to free themselves from the shackles of conformity of religious dogma. Also during this period, again, it was a very prolific period. Felix Adler was a rabbi in training. He went to Europe to train, and he trained under some of the philosophers over there in the Neo-Kantianism. He was supposed to take his father's role as the rabbi in the largest synagogue in New York City. He came back and preached a sermon, his first sermon, saying that God wasn't important in the religion, and the only important things in religion were two things: community and ethics. He didn't go very far as his father's successor. So he did form ethical culture. the American Ethical Union now, which also was instrumental in forming the ACLU, NAACP, Hull House, and other immigrant houses. Very, very prolific in the life of social welfare in New York and other communities. During this period, also this prolific period, was the Western Conference. The Western Conference was a group of Unitarian ministers in the Midwest who got together, who didn't believe in God, who embraced evolution, but felt like we still needed an overall arching story, and like Felix Adler, felt we needed ethics in the community. The figure on the left was John Dietrich. The figure on the right is Curtis Reese. They had a famous meeting in 1917 and were the first people who really said that what we're going to call this new thing that we're trying to put together was humanism. And what they're trying to say is, we're not stupid. We don't know everything, but we know enough that we can put all the pieces together of what a non-theistic life looks like, from Darwinian theory of modern ethics, philosophy, and they started that. Out of that, though, modernism was really popular then, and it was very positive. It was extremely optimistic about human possibilities. And one of the phrases then was, progress, onward and upward forever. But the Great War, World War I, dashed those possibilities about the goodness in humanity. We saw that both the potential of human beings have the great potential for good or evil. Also during this period, Freud saw religion as immaturity. Philosophically, logical positivism said that only that can be verified is worth talking about. But Gödel and Wittgenstein pointed out that any system that is consistent cannot be complete. And so what philosophy moved then towards what's called anti-foundationalism, meaning there are no absolute foundations for anything we believe, but we still can strike upon certain things using reason and science that John Dewey called truth as warranted assertability. It's part of the pragmatic philosophy called instrumentalism. Also at this time, Chicago School and Columbia School were dominated in both the arts and science and philosophy by the humanists there. In 1933, the Humanist Manifesto was written by a lot of Unitarian ministers and philosophers, trying to put together what the best we knew about a non-theistic life would look like. Because they said, everybody said, well, hold off. We don't want to be dogmatic and give a creed or anything. But permanent suspension of belief is neurosis, not enlightenment. So they put together best we know. And as we know, that was supplemented now with Humanist Manifesto 3. I urge everybody to get that off of the website, the American Humanist Association website. Download it. When people say, well, you atheists, you don't believe in anything, show them that. If you notice, here's a good definition of humanism. Humanism is a progressive philosophy of life that without supernaturalism affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good of humanity. Notice on this and all the way through Humanist Manifesto 3, there's only one negative statement, and it's without supernaturalism. But all the rest is positive statements about belief and, more important, affirmation about values. During the Depression, the humanist community kept together by various newsletters that were sent back and forth, especially by some of the founders of the Humanist Manifesto, especially Ed Wilson. And in 1949, the American Humanist Association was founded. But immediately they were under attack by the FBI. I got some great stories of them coming in and searching the things for all our communist sympathizers. The person here on the left is Corliss Lamont. He was a president of the AHA, the main founder. He's a philosopher at Columbia University, part of that Columbia humanist group, along with John Dewey and others. But anyway, he was the first person who filed and had a battle at the Supreme Court on the First Amendment. The person on the right was also a president of the American Humanist Association, Vassy McCollum, who filed the first separation of church and state. Her son, who was involved in that lawsuit, John McCollum, is still around, an attorney who fights for civil rights even to this day. So during that period, in the 50s, 85% of the UUs were humanists. And also during that period, Julian Huxley and many others put together the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which really almost reads like the Humanist Manifesto. Eleanor Roosevelt said that she was a humanist, couldn't come out publicly about it, but that's where she got some of the wording from. It was the Humanist Manifesto. But during that period, we also were the leaders on sexual rights, abortion rights. We fought McCarthy and civil rights. In 1953, the IHEU, which is called now the International Humanist Association, was formed and still is a major organization throughout the world. The 60s, though, ushered in a new age of postmodernism, neo-romantic era with the new age thinking, magical thinking revived. If you want a good book, understand that, read Kurt Anderson's book, Fantasyland. He has a whole history of all of that. But during this period, Madeline Murray O'Hara was on the board of the American Humanist Association, but as I'm sure you all know, she's pretty irascible. She left and formed her own organization. Ann Gaylor joined her for a while, but then she left and formed her own organization, the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Her daughter, Annie Laurie Gaylor, of course, is involved with that in 1980. But during this period, the religious right was attacking us all over. Billy Graham, Jerry Falwell, and Stangsley, and fundamentalism took off. We formed the skeptic movement. And in 1978, Paul Kurtz was the editor of the Humanist magazine, and he made a power play to take control of the finances. That didn't work out for him. So he split off and made his own organization, as you know, which is a great secular organization as well. I just want to say that our hearts long for an integrated view of life, for our ideals match reality, and long for a vital center to our lives that both grounds us and inspires us, a vision of greater authenticity to our lives. And we have that already in the secular humanist life right now. Now is our time, I say. Now is our chance to move society towards reason and the good life. Now is our time to move society out of the dark ages of theocratic and ideological control towards human fulfillment. And we can't falter in the face of certain hostility or our own inherent ambiguity. And we can't just idly stand by waiting and hoping for a secular society to automatically shape itself. It's our duty to show that the secular world need not end in nihilism. It's our obligation to demonstrate that we can build communities that can embrace a progressive, ethical, humanist world of human and global good. And I challenge everybody to fulfill that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. I could listen to so much more of what you have to say. There's so much depth of history that you have. And again, this is why we so appreciate you sharing your time with us today.